Paris is one of my favorite cities in the whole world. I first came here before the age of 10 and have been coming back dozens of times ever since. My parents lived here for more than a decade back in the 1960s and early 70s. I met my first wife here more than half a century ago when I was a 22-year-old graduate student. Now I'm on a 2-week visit to France with my partner Carol and 2 dear friends from Germany. On our first day, we visit several museums exhibiting our favorite Impressionist painters. Paris is striking by its abundance of beautiful buildings, parks, and bridges, many of which have remained intact for centuries. The Ile de la Cité is the center of medieval Paris. The most beautiful site on this island is Sainte-Chapelle, the royal chapel that contains an exquisite collection of stained glass windows from the 13th century. Following the French Revolution, the Revolutionary Tribunal met here in the Conciergerie prison. The deposed Queen Marie Antoinette was one of thousands of individuals who were tried and beheaded here during the ensuing reign of terror in the 1790s. Notre Dame Cathedral was damaged by a fire earlier this year and won't be open to visitors for years. Paris's largest cemetery is Père Lachaise. Over 1 million French citizens are buried here, in addition to such notable foreigners as Frédéric Chopin, Oscar Wilde, and Jim Morrison. The little town of Versailles has one of the most spectacular palaces anywhere. What began as a royal hunting lodge was vastly enlarged in the 17th century under the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Until the Revolution in 1789, Versailles served as the principal residence of French kings. More recently, the palace has been the site of major historical events. Following France's defeat in 1871, the victorious Prussian King Wilhelm I was proclaimed German Emperor in the splendid Hall of Mirrors. 2 generations later, in 1919, France turned the tables. Now it was German government officials who were forced to sign the vindictive Versailles Treaty that formally ended World War I and helped set the stage for another vengeful world war some 20 years later. After the abolition of the French monarchy, the palace was closed and fell into disrepair. Restoration efforts began late in the 19th century. Untold billions have been spent on this effort, along with repurchasing or recreating the original furnishings, fabrics, and wall hangings. Behind the palace are classic French formal gardens and a huge park that covers some 2,000 acres. In the park are scores of statues and some 50 fountains. Tucked away in the park is the Petit Trianon. This is a much smaller palace built for Louis XIV and his chief mistress, with whom he had 7 children. Today it's furnished as it was when it briefly served as Napoleon Bonaparte's residence. Nearby is the Petit Trianon, an even smaller chateau that Louis XV provided for his long-term mistress, the illustrious Madame de Pompadour. The last resident king, Louis XVI, gave this palace and its surrounding park to his 19-year-old bride, Queen Marie Antoinette, for her exclusive use. Nearby is the hamlet that the Queen had built as a kind of playground and private meeting place for herself and her closest friends. This picturesque hamlet includes a dairy, a farm designed to produce milk and eggs for the Queen, as well as a tower in the form of a lighthouse. Nobody, not even the King, could enter her property without the Queen's permission. Marie Antoinette and her friends enjoyed dressing up as shepherds and milkmaids to escape the stifling formality of court life and the many intrigues that dominated the main palace. The Picasso Museum is housed in one of the finest 17th century Parisian historic mansions, known as Hôtel Salé. A year after the artist's death in 1973, Picasso's family made an initial donation of 5,000 of his works in lieu of tax payments. Thousands of additional works were later donated in the years that followed. These include oil paintings, ceramics, sculptures in a variety of materials, and thousands of works on paper such as prints, engravings, and notebooks. The Marais is an extremely diverse neighborhood. Originally marshland outside the Paris city walls, from the Middle Ages until the 17th century, it was the site of royal palaces and other aristocratic residences. The district fell into disrepair when it was abandoned by noblemen fleeing violence in the wake of the French Revolution. The area became an active commercial area and home to a thriving Jewish community. During World War I, thousands of workers from China were recruited to work in France, and many who remained after the war settled in the Marais district. In the 1980s, Le Marais became the center of the LGBT culture and political activism. Almost half of all LGBT businesses in Paris are located here. Originally named Royal Square, the 400-year-old Place des Vosges is the oldest planned square in Paris. It was quite a novelty in the 1600s to have uniform red brick buildings over vaulted arcades. Before the Revolution, this was a popular site for aristocratic families to live and socialize. The Ile Saint-Louis is one of two natural islands in the Seine River. Today, it's home to one of the most extensive 17th and 18th century neighborhoods left in Paris, with lots of fine apartments, restaurants, and boutiques. I'm looking forward to our trip south to the Riviera, with its blue skies and milder Mediterranean weather. The French call this the Azure Coast, the Côte d'Azur. Our high-speed train takes about 5 hours from Paris to Cannes. A speedometer is displayed inside each coach. Even at speeds approaching 200 miles an hour, the train feels remarkably smooth and quiet. The house in Cannes, where we'll be spending 4 nights, is a pleasant surprise. It's furnished with a wild flair for style, humor, and imagination. The house contains an assortment of antiques and unusual collectibles. A room for grandchildren is filled with thousands of comics. Artwork and collectibles can be found everywhere, including in the bathroom, including in the shower. Less than an hour from our house in Cannes is Nice, France's 5th largest city. Our first stop on this very rainy day was in the Marc Chagall Museum, the first French national museum ever to be devoted to a living artist. It was inaugurated in 1973, 12 years before the Russian-born artist's death. Originally focused on the theme of the biblical message, the museum has expanded to more broadly include Chagall's works of religious and spiritual inspiration. Chagall designed the outdoor mosaic facing the pond for this specific site. Nice's Russian Orthodox Cathedral was built just before World War I with the support of Tsar Nicholas II. Ever since the 19th century, Nice has been a summer home to wealthy Russians. The Riviera is France's Florida with a lot more style, history, and class. The Negresco, Nice's finest hotel, opened over a century ago. The ballroom chandelier contains 16,000 pieces of crystal and was originally built for the Russian Tsar's Moscow palace. The dome was designed by Gustave Eiffel 20 years after he built the landmark tower in Paris. Only the historic facade remains of the Palais de la Méditerranée, once the home to a magnificent hotel, casino, and theater. British travelers began flocking to Nice in the 19th century and were soon followed by Belgians, Russians, and others. The main seaside walk is called the Promenade des Anglais, where English visitors once strolled in their finery. Nice was founded by Greeks in the 4th century BC, but it has since changed hands many times. Especially in the Old Town, the mixture of Italian and French architecture is most noticeable. The Coeur has been Nice's main market square since the Middle Ages. The region's largest flower market used to supply enough flowers for the entire country. The city is still known today for its flowers and perfume. Castle Hill rises up above the Old Town. Up until the 12th century, the entire population was crammed onto this hilltop for safety. Foundations of these earlier dwellings can now be excavated. The Cannes Film Festival takes place in May and is the most important one in the world. The most important thing for these guys is getting their oysters out of their shell. The French train system is quite fast and efficient, except when it's not. On the way to Monaco, our train broke down, much to the chagrin of the passengers who had to wait for over an hour in the midday sun until a replacement train arrived. Of the various trips by train we took, 2 were delayed by hours, and one day the train personnel were on strike. Monaco is the most densely populated country in the world. Its 40,000 people are sandwiched between the Alps and the sea, crammed onto a tiny strip of land less than a mile square. Though Monaco is a sovereign nation, France is responsible for its defense and foreign policy. Since the end of the 13th century, the country has been ruled by the Grimaldi dynasty. With no income tax at all, Monaco remains a notorious tax haven. 1/3 of the residents are millionaires. Since the opening of the Monte Carlo casino and a rail line to Paris in the 19th century, Monaco has been a playground for the very rich and those who want to be near them. The actress Grace Kelly was married to Prince Rainier III when she died in 1982. She's buried inside the cathedral in the Grimaldi family vault. Their son, Prince Albert II, became the country's current ruler in 2005. The palatial casino building was built in the classic Beaux-Arts style. It was designed by Charles Garnier, the same architect who created the Paris Opera. In addition to numerous gaming rooms, shops, restaurants, and public spaces, the building also has a magnificent theater offering operas and concerts. For well into the 20th century, the casino was the tiny principality's main source of income. By the 1990s, that figure was down to only 3%. This is the result of a value-added tax and other revenue streams that now provide the bulk of the country's income. The casino is owned by a public company in which the government and the royal family have a majority interest. It also owns leading hotels, sports clubs, restaurants, and nightclubs. The contrast between wealthy Monaco and the other nearby cities on the Riviera is striking. In the evenings, we enjoyed walking around Cannes near the Old Port to pick out a place for dinner at one of the many restaurants offering outdoor seating. Antibes is a lovely seaside resort that's home to the largest yacht harbor in Europe. Artists such as Matisse and Chagall were attracted to the area for its mild climate and excellent lighting conditions. In 1946, Picasso lived and worked for 6 months in a 12th century castle, the Chateau Grimaldi. Here he created hundreds of oil paintings, sketches, statues, and ceramics. Much of this work was later donated to the municipality, which transformed the medieval seaside castle into the world's first Picasso Museum. Antibes was founded by Greeks in the 4th century BC, as were most French Mediterranean towns. In the thousands of years since then, the town has changed hands numerous times. During the Roaring Twenties, Rudolph Valentino, Charlie Chaplin were among the movie stars and other celebrities who flocked to the Côte d'Azur. Shaded under the 19th century canopy, Antibes' bustling market offers fresh local produce, sausage, cheese, spices, pastry, and other goodies. One local specialty is a crepe or pancake made from chickpeas and baked in an outdoor oven. The old center of town is a charming maze of tiny winding streets lined with attractive boutiques, schools, restaurants, cafes, bars, and ice cream shops. As usual, it took a while to find just the right place to eat. Our lunch in the main square was accompanied by some amazing street performers. Close to Nice is Villefranche-sur-Mer. The Rue Obscure is a dark street under the harbor front houses that was built in the 13th century. Towering above the city is the Citadel, part of a huge castle built in the 1500s by the Duke of Savoy. The single entrance into this enormous complex was originally over a drawbridge suspended over a dry moat, known as the Kill Zone. Today, the Citadel houses Villefranche's City Hall, police station, assorted art galleries, and an outdoor theater. The Alpine mountain range literally rises out of the Mediterranean Sea here and extends northward for 700 miles across Europe to Austria. After centuries of being under Greek and later Roman rule, in the Middle Ages, Villefranche was a notorious pirate's nest. The region frequently changed hands over 5 centuries, as French forces battled invaders from Italy, Spain, England, and Turkey, before it permanently became part of France in 1860. The oldest part of Cannes is called Le Suquet. What began as a Greek fishing village later became a Roman outpost. On top of Le Suquet Hill, there was an 11th century castle overlooking what was then swampland below. Today, visitors can climb the winding cobblestone streets that were laid out over 400 years ago.
That's I just love being photographed.
Most of the houses in this area are many centuries old and provide stunning views of the city, the bay, and the harbor below. After our visit to the Riviera, we looked forward to returning to Paris. The wonderful Parisian hostess Corinne had arranged for a splendid lunch in a restaurant on the site of a former train station. I was rather familiar with this part of Paris, where my parents had lived and worked 50 years ago. One of our favorite small Parisian museums is the Marmottan, originally a hunting lodge at the edge of the Boulogne forest. After the building opened as a museum in 1934, it was gifted several major art collections. The Marmottan now owns the largest collection of works by Claude Monet, whose son Michel donated over 300 of the artist's works to the museum. Before reacquainting ourselves with the works by Monet, we were treated to a fascinating exhibit of Piet Mondrian's figurative art. It's instructive to see his early paintings of trees and windmills evolving into the abstract geometric paintings for which he's so well known today. In 1883, Claude Monet moved to a country home outside of Paris in Giverny, where he lived for over 40 years. His extensive gardens and paintings from this period reflect his passion for colors, gardening, and the ever-changing effects of sunlight. The flagship of the Printemps department store chain dates back to 1865. It was recently purchased by a Qatari investment fund. Our final excursion of the day is to Montmartre, the highest point in the city. It's known primarily for its colorful artistic history and as a popular nightclub district. The Basilica of Sacre-Coeur, completed in 1914, is one of the most visited landmarks in Paris. Its gleaming white limestone structure is visible from all around the city. The mosaic in the apse is one of the largest in the world. The plaza in front of Sacré-Cœur offers an impressive panoramic view of Paris. It's also a favorite place for musicians and other street performers to showcase their talent. Here's a memorial to Dalida, the Italian pop singer who committed suicide in 1987. This couple dancing outdoors on the cobblestone streets of Montmartre looks like a scene from a film, which is what it really is. The Church of Saint-Jean de Montmartre was completed in 1904, one of the few in the Art Nouveau style of the period. It's also the first example of reinforced concrete used in a church construction. The organ came from a church in Lyon and was installed here in 1910. At the end of a full day of sightseeing, we enjoyed dinner at L'Argument, our favorite local restaurant. The Museum of Natural History is affiliated with the Sorbonne University and has 14 sites throughout France. The galleries of paleontology and comparative anatomy are housed in an Art Nouveau building that opened in 1898. It contains nearly 1,000 skeletons, along with fossilized plants and animals. This botanical garden is the largest in France. It was originally the royal garden of medicinal plants that King Louis XIII created here 4 centuries ago. Today's collection on the 75-acre campus contains some 8 million plants. The Gallery of Evolution has a number of impressive exhibits that include extinct species. They also explore the effects of humans on the evolution of other species. Within the Jardin des Plantes is La Ménagerie with some 1,200 mainly small and mid-sized animals. This is France's oldest zoo and one of 4 in Paris. While some of the cages here date from the 19th century, this little historic menagerie contains a number of endangered and threatened species, including red pandas and snow leopards. Originally called the People's Democratic Zoo, it was established in 1794, shortly after the French Revolution. Its purpose was to display the animals from the royal menagerie at Versailles, so that commoners could experience these exotic animals as well. The first elephants arrived at the end of the 18th century, followed by bears, giraffes, and other animals from around the world. During the 19th century, the zoo grew in size until the Siege of Paris in 1870, when many of the animals were slaughtered and used to feed starving Parisians. On our final weekend, we took a train to Normandy from Gare Saint-Lazare, one of 7 major train stations in Paris. In the small town of Bayeux, we visited the Tapestry Museum. Its principal display is not really a tapestry, but a huge 230-foot-long embroidered cloth. It depicts William the Conqueror's rise from Duke of Normandy to become King of England. Looking much like a cartoon or graphic novel, this precious artifact is made of wool embroidered onto linen cloth. Depicted here is the defeat of England's last Anglo-Saxon King Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. The embroidery was probably made in England in the 11th century. Until recently it was displayed annually in the Bayeux Cathedral. Built on the site of a Roman temple, Bayeux's Notre-Dame Cathedral is as big as the one in Paris. It clearly dominates this little town of Bayeux with its mere 14,000 inhabitants. The cathedral dates from the 11th century. It was originally built in the Norman Romanesque style. Later it served as a fortress and was heavily damaged. It has since been rebuilt in the Gothic style. The ornate stonework is most impressive, as are the stained glass windows and the beautiful 19th century organ. The original organ was destroyed by Huguenots in the 16th century. During the Middle Ages, the crypt was walled shut and forgotten until it was rediscovered in the late 15th century. The Corinthian columns are topped with well-preserved depictions of angels playing various instruments. Only 6 miles from Normandy's D-Day landing site, Bayeux is the closest city to the beaches that was not destroyed. Because the Allies needed an intact city from which to administer the push to Germany, Bayeux was spared bombing and survived the war without major damage. We spent the night in the historic Hôtel Lion d'Or, which served as the English press headquarters after D-Day. General Eisenhower liked to eat at his favorite restaurant here, and may on occasion have even spent the night.
Les magazines fracassent en public.
The initial stop on our tour of D-Day sites was Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, the first village to be retaken by the Allies. The 60 German soldiers here used the church tower as an observation post. They were surprised and confused coastal bombardment beginning after midnight on June 6, 1944, since the Allied invasion was expected in Calais over 100 miles to the east. Firefights broke out in and around this church, which still bears some bullet holes. Our weather was typical for the Normandy coast, alternating between rainstorms and sunny skies. Bad weather also delayed the D-Day assault by a day. The first of multiple landing waves began at 6:30 a.m. The soldiers had spent 3 hours in their landing craft before walking the final minutes through water onto the beach, codenamed Utah. They were soon followed by thousands more soldiers, along with engineers, tanks, trucks, and other vehicles. In less than an hour, they had secured the immediate area. By the end of the day, 21,000 American troops had landed and pushed 6 miles inland. Sainte-Mère-Église is another small town where American paratroopers rained down in the early morning darkness on June 6th. One of the paratroopers, John Steele, got his parachute caught on a church spire, where he hung for hours pretending to be dead. He was later captured by the Germans, but eventually escaped and rejoined his division. His daring experiences were dramatized in the award-winning 1962 movie The Longest Day. Pointe du Hoc overlooks both American D-Day landing beaches. The plan was for 3 companies of Rangers to land by sea, climb up the 100-foot cliffs and take out the German defenses. Less than half the 225-man assault force reached the top alive, but they managed to hold on until reinforcements arrived the next day. Some French civilians accused of helping the Germans were later executed. Taking the 5-mile-long Omaha beach on D-Day was the responsibility of American troops with the help of British, Canadian, and Free French forces. Very little went as planned, as the majority of landing craft missed their targets due to ocean currents and stronger than expected German defenses. Tanks finally arrived and helped secure a beachhead. Of the 6,000 Americans killed on D-Day, most perished here. Over the coming weeks, a total of 25,000 Americans would eventually die in the battle for Normandy. A third of them are buried in the American cemetery located on a bluff just above Omaha Beach. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the former president's son, is buried here, as are 33 pairs of brothers, a father and son, 4 women, 149 Jews, and a like number of African Americans. The number of German casualties is unknown. On our last day in Paris, we take a final look at the city's magnificent Hôtel de Ville, the City Hall. For the past 7 centuries, the city's administration has been located on this same spot, once a river port for unloading wheat and wood. In the 18th century, it was the headquarters of the French Revolution, and in the 19th century, the Paris Commune was based here before they burned the building. The Centre Georges Pompidou is the largest modern art museum in Europe. The unusual building was designed by an international team of architects headed by Renzo Piano. Since it opened in 1977, it has welcomed almost 200 million visitors. While the exterior is currently being renovated, the interior remains a mecca for art lovers wishing to explore the Pompidou's extraordinary collection of modern masters: Kandinsky, Klee, Matisse, Miro, Mondrian, Picasso, and so many others who had an enormous influence on later artists. For many centuries, France has stood at the forefront of Western history. Beginning in the 17th century, Louis XIV's court at Versailles set an example that was unattainable by other European royals. Since the Enlightenment, France has been a beacon of freedom, which has attracted millions of visitors, refugees, and immigrants from around the world. The French Revolution in 1789 deposed the monarchy and sent shock waves throughout Europe. A century later, the Paris Commune of 1871 established a radical socialist government that lasted less than 3 months, but that inspired later revolutions in Russia and China. Perhaps more than any other country, France has succeeded in pioneering new ways of thinking, experiencing, and seeing life, while preserving as much as possible of the nation's colorful heritage. At its best, French culture reflects a unique sense of style, along with a rare balance between individual freedoms and collective social action. The challenges for France today are similar to those facing other advanced industrial countries. Until recently, France had the second largest colonial empire in the world behind the British Empire. European countries will all need to make a greater effort to integrate millions of immigrants from the Middle East and Africa. Broadly speaking, they all need to figure out how to move forward toward a more just and sustainable future. I'm curious to see how France can continue to preserve the best of its past while transforming the rest of its future. No need to pardon my French when I say Vive la France.